Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you from the Colonial Dungeon, this is the Court-Martail Podcast! Introducing your host for this evening, he has a bald spot on the top of his head, and he weighs in tonight at a number you don't need to know. He is the Colonial Loudmouth, Sean McCarty!
And welcome one and all once again to yet another exhilarating edition of the Court-Martail Podcast. I am, as always, your Colonial champion, Sean McCarty, riding solo here today. Primarily because our esteemed co-host in training, Skyler Greenberg, messed up some dates, so as punishment, we're going to have to wait until next week for AEW's review. And unfortunately, that also means we still have to watch AEW's Full Gear. But regardless, that's going to happen next week, so it's just me this week. But as always, we have a lot to talk about. And there is no shortage. Because rest assured, I promise to deliver on twice the fun, even though only half of our usual contingent is here. At the end of the day, Colonial Champion, Court-Martail Podcast, let's get it going. And we are going to do something fun today. I have got on my laptop here the different eras of WWE. I've got two different sites, and I will cite my sources while we're at it. The first, which I am not using any of the actual red text, I'm just doing this for the actual dates and numbers. The first is Wikipedia, which I know as soon as somebody says, you can't use Wikipedia as the source, Wikipedia is for a bunch of pussies. And I'm going to say, no, it's just going to be for what the general information is at the time. And because I'm cross-referencing that with WWE.com, it seems like we've got some accuracy going on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to label out all of the errors. Then we're going to shuffle them up and organize them from worst to best in your Colonial Champion's opinion. Now, I'm sure, what you're going to want to know is what is the prerequisite? What is going to constitute one getting favor over the other? Here's the criteria. I'm looking for the kind of gates that we're bringing in, and this is specifically for WWE, because this is WWE eras. The kind of gates that were drawn, the kind of wrestlers on the roster, the top guys, the underrated guys, the overall vibe, I guess would be the right word, of what's going on during that particular era, what it brought, the good, the bad, the ugly, and what's really going to separate the best from the worst is how much we're getting of not only pro wrestling, but also of what has eventually incorporated WWE into entertainment. And what the brand of pro wrestling, or now sports entertainment, that WWF all the way to the WWE have done. So here are the eras that we are going to be ranking. We are going to be ranking the WWF era, the Vincent J. McMahon era, which I could have added the Capital Wrestling Corporation, which allegedly was founded by Jess McMahon, but that has never been confirmed. There have been reports of both. It could have been Vincent J. McMahon back in the late 50s or the early 50s, or Jess McMahon, who is the father of Vincent J., who is the father of Vincent K. And I did not notice, so we're going to be talking about the WWF. We're going to be talking about the transition era, which is by the way, the WWF, we're going to be talking specifically from the early 60s to right around 1980. Then the transition from Vincent J to Vincent K, which is from 79 to 82. Then the Golden Era, which is the Rock and Wrestling Connection, the Hulk Hogan era from 1982 to 1993. The New Generation era, which took place around the mid-90s So what it says here on the wiki is about 1993 to 1997, which is just about right. The WWE one is a little more vague on it. They're going, like they say, the golden age, 80s to early 90s, new generation, early to mid 90s. So they didn't really, they don't really go into specifics until the ruthless aggression era, which we'll get to in a second. So we get the new the Worldwide Wrestling Federation era, the transition, the golden era, the new generation, the attitude era, of course, goes without saying, the ruthless aggression era, the attitude era branded from 1997 to 2002, although many consider 2001 to be the end of the attitude era, but there was that the alliance and the invasion angle, and you can't really put that, even though it does kind of exist in a bubble, I would still tail end that on attitude era. Ruthless aggression era, 2002 to 2008. The PG era, which is 2008 to 2013. The reality era, which is 2014 to 2016. And then, of course, the new era, which is 2016 to now. And that gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 items to rank. And I did not do this. I did not fix the outcome, so I am actually doing this rather improvisationally. So we're going to be looking at these and kind of just talking our way through this, and we're going to have this ranking feel a little bit more improv, which is going to be kind of fun. Now, I think when it comes to number 9, as far as what the worst era in WWE's history is, I would probably say right now, I would say the new era is the worst. When it comes to the quality of what wrestling has become, as far as the tricks, the dives, the overall gymnastics attitude, the let's not care about working, let's care more about our own vanity projects, a la doing every move under the sun and 16 dives and losing more of the subtleties that went into pro wrestling. Like nobody has body language anymore. Everybody does the same moves. And WWE's own formatting, which has hurt it probably the most, where they don't want anybody getting over on the program because they don't want anybody more over than the program. Which is why nobody in the mainstream knows any wrestlers anymore. Which is why nostalgia acts are so popular, because then all of a sudden, back when WWE wanted to make stars, they brought stars, real stars, stars that really drew, not just drew the same amount of money that they've been drawing for years and years and years, that didn't include sponsorship deals and licensing deals. Now, when I said earlier the prerequisites about the criteria of having drawing power, I did not mean licensing deals and the profits that WWE's been making. They make more money now than they did in any other era of wrestling. But that is not necessarily a good thing, in my opinion, because the hunger to do better is completely gone, and it's completely sterile, and that's also why they don't want anyone really getting over on a real consistent basis. So it's a shame. But WWE's format is a large reason why this era of wrestling is the worst. As far as stars go, there's a lot of great talent. I mean, the talent pool is really large for those people who are really trying to work. And WWE does have good workers. It's just that the style of wrestling is not as good, but and the format and finishes and writing is just as bad. The booking is absolutely atrocious. So nobody feels like the stars, even though the talent roster is quite solid. But also you got to factor in the way that some people look versus the way other people look. But they do a pretty good job of getting the good ones in and the bad ones out in WWE as opposed to other places. So it's not as bad. I would say more booking alone has this one probably in the worst spot. There's really no comparison here for any other era here to really make the case for that. And no, I'm not just going to be going in descending order, because then we move on to, I guess, number 8. I'm going to put at number 8 Probably the reality era. And I would say, you know, I might be more apt to put the reality era actually before the new era, but the reality era had, I think, just a few more moments that were worthy of this point. I mean, it's a 2-year era. I mean, the thing that really hurts it the most is McMahon's, as they all do, but really, when you think about it, this was like the Authority. I think it kind of still been going at this point, which had really hurt everything. The biggest thing was kind of the Undertaker's losing the streak, and Brock Lesnar's ascent, and what Brock Lesnar was able to do. And you talk about big major stars. In 2014, John Cena was still around, who was still a draw to some degree. Roman Reigns was developing, but was going to be pushed way too far down the throat, kind of as on the flip side of that. Brock Lesnar's return, and then really ultimate ascent into the way upper echelon. Not that he wasn't already a big name attraction and a big draw coming out of UFC, but moreover, the fact when Brock became the final boss, when Brock became the guy that everybody had to beat over, and this was when it was fresh and it wasn't recycled 10 or 11 times, which is why the new era gets the bump for me, because the reality era the new era drops and the reality era stays at 8 because there was that defining moment where Brock Lesnar became that big draw and the really last remaining draw that WWE had, especially as John Cena was starting to kind of transition his way out, even though he still had more world titles to win because it's John Cena after all. But this was also a time, I think, the reality era where the network launched. This really should be called the network era, because when the network launched, then it really opened the doors for what WWE was eventually going to become, which is like the main roster product is garbage, but they've got all of this Netflix original programming type stuff, which is what they really wanted to do to begin with. And there's been a lot of good that came out of that. And I think that's a big part of why the reality era comes in. Now, the new era, as far as what they do with the network, their network stuff is tremendous. A lot of that stuff is really well shot and really well done. I mean, a lot of it's garbage too, but a lot of it's really well done. So I got to give the new era that. But the thing about the reality era that sticks out for me is that this was something where everything seemed insufferable and everything seemed insufferable in the reality era. But you got to also remember that this is when peak NXT was just starting to come into play. The real NXT, and that's what gets the edge for me, because this 2014 through 2016 provided some of the best takeovers, I think, as far as what they were trying to accomplish. Their soon ascent into the real major, like the Four Horsewomen and NXT hitting their peak was coming right around this time. And 2016 was really that moment, right in this transition between reality and new, where that really started to manifest itself. And so in that respect, I think the reality era deserves the nod. Besides, the reality era, as cringy as some of the stuff was, it wasn't as insulting to intelligence as the things in the new era are. And I hate to pinpoint Otis specifically, but he's a perfect example. The gimmick that Otis and Tucker have is a perfect example. And they've always had crap gimmicks come through, a la the Spirit Squad. I'm not saying they haven't. But there was still, at that time, in the Ruthless Aggression era, more seriousness taken when it all came to pass. Nothing felt stilted. Nothing felt... They still let wrestlers be wrestlers. They still felt some authenticity there. And really, the new era... The reality era started that decline, and the new era just went and dead and buried it. I mean, you look at some of these shows between 2016 and now. Some of them are great, but a lot of it is just redundant crap, and there's nobody over and nothing makes any sense anymore. There's no continuity. At least in 2014 to 2016, they were trying to retain some semblance of that. But personally, from 2014 to now, in both eras included, the plot has been lost on wrestling, at least in WWE. It has been completely lost to all the other mess of stuff that they're doing, and that's kind of where that stands. So at number 8 is going to go the reality era. Now, number 7, I'm going to say for number 7, I'm going to go with the transitional era. I'm going to go for the transitional era because this was there was a lot of confusion here when Vincent J gave to Vincent K. And what I didn't know is that Vincent K is the one who decided to go with the rebrand and get the Wide out of the WWF. So they applied for the trademark WWF when Vince took over. That was something I did not know until I kind of scoured through these to look it up. And the thing about the transition era specifically is that there wasn't really an identity at this moment. They had not gotten Hogan, or Hogan wasn't really anything yet. I don't even think he was there yet. Hogan was still, I believe, come 81, 82, this is something, and maybe actually I might have been even later than that, because Hogan was still with the AWA. He had done Rocky 3. Wally was still with the AWA, but Hogan was drawing stupid crowds for the AWA there. But really what this era was more plucking the talent than it was showcasing what they already had, which was, I think, why this ends up so low on the list. It's like this was more of like the setup to the payoff. And what that ended up doing is it kind of made the houses a little uninspiring. They were still selling, don't get me wrong. They were still selling pretty well, which is why, you could make the argument that New Generation or even PG era or even Ruthless Aggression should go underneath this when it comes to drawing power. But the fact of the matter is the houses weren't drawing as well from 79 to 82. And it was going to take all Hogan coming and becoming something. And Backlund, no offense to Backlund, he was a good champion, but he was not the kind of draw that Bruno was or Pedro was, and obviously the Sheik was not going to hold it for long. You want to talk about transitional champion. But the Backlund era, it's not that Bob wasn't a good champion, because he was, which is why they gave him 3 years, but I think it was just a little uninspiring. And because the identity of WWE was shifting so much at this point, because it was going from the old pro wrestling days, Vince was now starting to inject wrestlers in that were going to move it along and coax it toward sports entertainment a little bit more. And that kind of transition of identity really, I think, hurt them across the board. But thankfully, obviously it worked out. And you also got to consider too, because Bruno was really starting to kind of fade off and finish off what he was doing too. So then you get this whole thing, the Zbyszko thing, I think had either already come to pass or it was right happening here. And again, it's not like they weren't drawn, they were doing fine. I'm not saying they weren't doing fine, but it was going to take more of something to make it worth watching. And I think Vince knew that. And that's part of why this movement into the golden era ended up being with The Rock and wrestling and all of that. So it's a weird one to put this low, because at the end of the day, when it comes to draws and the gates and that money, this transition period definitely was worth acknowledgement as far as what they were able to accomplish business-wise. But as far as the entertainment side of it too, and as far as what the pro wrestling was, it was leaving something to be desired, I think. And that's what, and it's no disrespect to Backlund, because I've seen Backlund matches and he's good. I'm not saying he's not. It was just so much a departure from what Bruno was and what Bruno was going for at the time, and the way that the Bruno's look, his run, and the people like Ivan Koloff and the guys and Bob Backlund is in terrific shape. I'm not saying he isn't, But you gotta know he's also a fairly small guy. You know, everyone says that the WWE is the land of the giants. Backlund was not that tall of a dude. He wasn't that tall. He wasn't, he was built. He definitely had a physique to him. There's no disputing that. I mean, Backlund would stretch me just by looking at me. But when it came to what the other kinds of wrestlers were at the time, and I'm not talking about the beefed up, juiced up Hogans, but like, look at Ivan Koloff and the way that he was, his presentation, or even George Steele, and some of the, and there were just, it was a larger presence. It was a more physical presence than I think Bob really was. Then that's not to say that Bob wasn't a good champion. Again, it's just an interesting period because it's got its good, it's got its bad, like all of these do. But the wrestling was solid, the gates were solid, but its identity and I've said that several times, and what they were and what they were becoming lifted this a little bit in translation. Which brings us to number 6. Number 6, I am going to say, is probably the PG era. We're going to move back into the newer stuff. And the reason the PG era gets the edge here is that there was still from 2008 to 2013, you were getting some finishing touches. I think this kind of suffers the same fate, and I almost would tie this with the transition, and maybe I might flip it come hell or high water. I might flip PG era and put this PG era underneath transition, because PG era in a lot of ways is very much similar to the transition era in the way that they didn't really have an identity. It had very large talent leave. It had Shawn Michaels left. Edge retired. Triple H started wrestling a little bit less. You didn't see him nearly as much. We saw nothing but John Cena. And this is really what that is. John Cena was not what Hogan was. John Cena could draw, but not the kind of numbers that Hogan was. And I hate that comparison, because this was where WWE started to shift their format and really recognize the shift in format. This is where the writing really started getting a stranglehold. This is where Cena couldn't not get over, because I think Vince was afraid of other people getting over, and I think Vince realized that he wanted John Cena, the PG poster boy, to be his last real star. And he lost John too, and I'm sure that eats him up to this day. But really, and the reality of it is, the PG era is when I actually lost favor with wrestling. I didn't really watch any of it, didn't really care about the stars. I would say when it comes to the talent pool, this was probably one of the weakest talent pools of any roster here. And if it weren't for the lost the plot insultingness that was the reality in the new era, I would put the PG era lower. But the thing that makes the PG era, that gives it the edge here, is that there were moments that were big moments. When it comes to 2009 was a great year as far as what Orton and I'm Cena, but Orton really coming into his own, the kind of stuff that, Triple H and Shawn were still doing. It wasn't all perfect, no, but it did bring about some new talent that are widely successfully regarded today, and I'm looking mainly at Cody Rhodes, but even Aaron Stevens got his start here and kind of got big in this group as far as what the man formerly known as Damian Sandow. There are, among others, but this was a time when it was very apparent that new stars were not coming. And Daniel Bryan, the ascent of Daniel Bryan is another one that's worth here. CM Punk, again, his launch into superstardom, or as much superstardom as you can get in this era, was big for what he was doing. I mean, they had some talented people on the roster, but for every one of those, you had the flop of the Nexus. For every one of those, you had a really interesting Bray Wyatt. I think Bray Wyatt came, what was it, 2013, I think? 2013 or 2014 was Cena Wyatt, and we all know how that went. And then remember the Embrace the Hate with Cena and Kane, and what Zack Ryder would end up becoming. And then that's a perfect example of why this PG era, I'm actually flipping this into the 7th position and popping transition up to 6, because the more I think about the PG era, the less I'm remembering that I really enjoy. But in the same way, it kind of capped off the Big Star era. Is coming to a close. We still got The Undertaker. We got Brock Lesnar back, so we did pick one up, so that's, that's good for us. But let's have him lose to John Cena on the first pay-per-view back. This is where I think things just started coming off the rails a little bit for WWE in a very apparent way. More apparent than it was before. That, especially in the Ruthless Aggression era, that things were definitely changing, and not necessarily for the better. Things were, the format of how they were going to template wrestling was going to drastically change to fit their shareholders and really drastically alter their gameplay. And that's why, NXT got launched, which was big in long term. But at the end of the day, I'm thinking about this. I might even bump PG down another one. I might put the reality era over the PG era. The PG era, I liked Punk. That was probably the best thing about it. CM Punk was probably the best thing about the PG era. And it was the only thing, probably because he wasn't PG about it. And remember how that summer of Punk ended? With a Triple H versus Kevin Nash sledgehammer on a top of a ladder match. That's how that feud ended, folks. Just to remind you, from where Money in the Bank 2011 was, that's how that ended. Because Kevin Nash texted himself from Triple H's phone, I think. I don't know. It was all very confusing. And that's kind of my overall point here, is that this was really the start of what I consider the descent into pure entertainment and a whole lot less wrestling. And moreover, it didn't quite do it the way that I would have wanted to do it. The other reason I think I'm going to bump the reality era over the PG era, we're going to recite this all in era, and you were seeing improvisation at work. I did preface that. The reason I think I'm going to pop the reality era over is that it had the real launch of the Shield, and what the Shield was, the betrayal, Seth Rollins, the heist of the century. The Shield started in the PG era, but really when they came into their own was the reality era. And I think those are probably the only 3 guys who really became true stars. And of course, 2016 was the pickup of AJ Styles, which you got to also agree was another big coup. So, yeah, I think I'm going to make... So, the new list as it stands, as we get here now, as I speak to you amidst the confusion. The new era, number 9, which is 2016 to now. The PG era, number 8, from 2008 to 2013. The reality era, number 7, 2014 to 2016. And then the transitional period, 1979 to 1982, in 6th place. 5th. Now I think in 5th I'm going to have to put the New Generation era. And the New Generation era, the reason I will put this here is that the New Generation era was really starting to... There was talent here that would eventually become incredibly big stars and would really boom in the Attitude Era, but you didn't see it because Vince was going through another really cartoony formatting change. And this was I think this was the first real glimpse. And maybe this is just in hindsight as a guy who was raised on WWE, and I'm sure there are plenty of other wrestling fans who grew up on other promotions who would say, no, this was always apparent from what Vince and Kay was trying to do. But to me, the New Generation era, which is kind of what I grew up on, at least to start with the VHS tapes I got from the video store, for those of you who even remember what those are, the thing about the New Generation era is that it had a lot of talent that would remain talent and important through the years with Hall and Nash and Triple H and Michaels and Waltman. I just listed the entirety of the clique. But also people like, you were getting a bit from Yokozuna. You got Bret, obviously, was huge come this time. Bret Hart was the one who launched it, and Bret was big. The feud with Bret and Owen was terrific. You still had Neidhart. You got Bulldog, that Intercontinental match between Bulldog and Bret Hart. Another really big, another big match. There was a lot of good to come out of this. And for those people who really don't like Sid or Psycho Sid, he had his moments here in the Attitude Era. They weren't always the best, but he had his moments. That was hindered a lot by the fact that the rest of the roster was made to be an occupation. They had Kane on the roster, but he was a dentist. Or Fake Diesel. They had the guy who trained everyone in FCW, Skinner, who trained everyone in FCW. Al Snow, another huge trainer, trains a lot of guys. He was Leaf Cassidy. Sparky Plug Bob Holly. I can go on. T.L. Hopper, the guy Dirty White Boy, which we talked about, and we'll talk about maybe if we get to it, if it's not too long, in our match of the week with him and Tracy Smothers. But he was a plumber, and he was made to be absolutely useless. And that kind of Repo Man, for the love of God, the man who was formerly Smash, who is formerly the man from Mid-South, Crusher Darso, terrific worker. He was playing a guy who repossessed cars. Okay, this is why the New Generation era didn't work. Because the gimmicks were so stupid and cringy and very obviously phony and, oh, we got a wrestling garbage man. Bring him on in. Oh, you like hockey? Now you're the goon. It was just dumb. It was overly phony, cartoonish. And yes, Hogan was cartoonish, but there was still a level of realism amidst the format itself. It was still a wrestling roster full of wrestlers rather than a couple of wrestlers and a series of gimmicky occupations, and that's really what it boiled down to. And really, when it comes to it, Shawn Michaels was not that big of a... The houses were down, significantly down. Shawn wasn't as good a draw as I think Vince expected him to be. Same goes for Nash, because Nash had, you talk about the abysmal 95 and the title run that Nash did. He was one of the worst drawing champions in history, and I like Kevin Nash for the most part. I got nothing against the guy. His matches weren't always the best, but I do recall really enjoying his WrestleMania match. I think it was at 12 with Undertaker. Because it was a terrific match. I really enjoyed what those two put together. When you thought a house fight like that wouldn't quite make the cut, Nash made it happen. Scott was great. Waltman was showing what he can do. Bret kept going. I mean, the talent was there. It's just that the format was so bad that it drew a lot of people away, which is why the NWO made such a big impact in the grittier WCW at the time, and which is why the New Generation era inevitably had to go. It had to go. Let's not talk about the Ringmaster, Chili McFreeze, or Sexton Hardcastle, or any of that. It's like, I think Sexton Hardcastle might have been WCW, but in any event, there's a lot of good in the New Generation era that's marred by crap formatting and crap gimmick. In the same way that this era now suffers. But this era now is not nearly, well, I can't say it's not nearly as bad. It's close to being as bad, but it's not as bad. In fact, they almost suffer the opposite problem, that nobody feels like there's no identity with any of the members of the roster now, because they all do the same stuff, instead of it being too diverse because everybody's an outlandish gimmick. But it was a weird time. It was a weird time, but they were still good. It kept things afloat. But definitely things, once WCW started going, really started to go downhill, which is where the Attitude Era comes in. And technically the Transition Era did outdraw by a lot the New Generation Era, but I think what wrestling was to become soon after this, in the same way, this was another setup era to a good era. And as such, it suffers a little bit because of that. And for those of you who are more of the sports entertainment fans rather than the wrestling fans, the New Generation Era is, I would say, if you really wanted to break it down, 6 and 5, the Transition and New Generation Era, I'd put them on par. Because the only thing about the Transition Era is, yes, Backlund was fine and the houses were still drawing. They were not losing the kind of business the way that the New Generation Era was, just for formatting alone. But I think that a part of that was the fact that Vincent J was still had his hand in part of it, and New Generation was strictly Vince. But I would still kind of equate them in that respect, as far as, because there was some more entertainment value, I would suppose, in New Generation Era, just a little bit more than in the Transition Era. And that brings us to number 4. And we've got 4 eras left. I'm going to put, for this one, I'm going to put the WWF. And that's a long span of time. I'm going to put, so this is the Bruno Sammartino era. This is when Bruno was selling on Madison Square Garden every single night. And people were going crazy to see him anywhere and everywhere. He was the Northeast, you know, and he just wasn't as popular elsewhere. He would do work elsewhere, but he was just not as popular elsewhere. The WWF did him right. Same with superstar Billy Graham before him. You know, and Billy Graham, or I was before, or like during the same time, Billy Graham was big here. They had a lot of guys. This was a really fun era of wrestling because it was over. I mean, when you talk about the business, I mean, WWF did great business. You know, it was because it was the territory, so they didn't really have to worry about a mass expansion of market, which I think is another reason why the Transition Era goes below, because that Transition Era was also into cable network and television and getting onto a national stage, which is why business was down a little bit. But we're talking about 20 years of solid Vincent J booking. And yes, the stuff was still a little cartoony, but it was not nearly as cartoon. I mean, it was a lot more pro wrestling than it was sports entertainment. There was no sports entertainment about it. And I really do recommend anyone who does have the network to take a peek into some old school wrestling from 1976. I want to say it's called All-Star Wrestling in the classics, in the classic shows, or All-Time. It's All-Time or All-Star, something like that. But there's some 1976, 1977 matches, and yes, it's going to bore the crap out of you, I'm sure. But if you go into it with the mind that they were trying to make this look like an actual competition and an actual combat sport, then you'll have a better time watching it. And I also believe that you all should watch Superstar Billy Graham's promos because they are fantastic. And, and there's some real fun promo work there that I think you really like. I think you would really like. It's a long period. There's a lot of people who came and went at this time. So, but, you know, it was all on the back of Bruno Sammartino. But you got those matches like the cage match and the return match when Stan Hansen broke Bruno Sammartino's neck. There's a great match, which I think is still on the network, which is Bruno Sammartino and Killer Kowalski. Really, really worth watching. Great, absolutely fantastic contest. And the list goes on. You can find good Bruno Sammartino matches everywhere. I mean, Bruno and WWF could rely on him because he was that kind of guy. You know, he was that good at bringing the people in. He obviously had the ethnic advantage just based on the town of, New York City. That was kind of the bread and butter of what Bruno Sammartino was. And he connected with those people, and that's why he was so successful. Would Bruno Sammartino have been successful in like the NWA? Probably not. It's a different format. It's a different kind of people and a different kind of presentation. But he was the right guy for the right time in the right place in the right territory, and they made buckets and buckets and buckets and buckets of money, and that's something that nobody can ever take away from Vincent J. or Bruno Sammartino for that matter. So this is why it gets number 4. The only reason I don't rank this higher is that when it comes to WWE and what WWE became, and I've mentioned identity before. When you look at WWE's identity as a whole, the WWF sadly matters little in what consequentially would be what people now come to consider WWE to be and have always been. And especially why I put New Era last, when you've got a match, quote unquote, that basically takes the piss out of ever caring or liking pro wrestling to begin with, a la the Firefly Funhouse match at WrestleMania. It's very apparent why this doesn't get ranked higher, because it's yes, it drew a ton of money, yes, it had stars, and it was great, it was absolutely great, but sadly when Vince took over, it was not so much about keeping that and keeping that identity, but completely reshaping it. And as a whole of what WWE is, this was more pro wrestling heavy than it was the blend of pro wrestling and sports entertainment, which is where I'm putting the top. Yeah, at the top. The blend with like the perfect mix of what WWE is looking for. So then comes number 3. And number 3 is the Attitude Era. Let me explain. The Attitude Era had undoubtedly the greatest 2 wrestlers of all time. The 2 greatest wrestlers as far as drawing power. The 2 biggest drawing wrestlers ever in the history of the sport. Bar none, Steve Austin, The Rock. Every single financial piece of business that you could find verifies this, confirms this notion. Which is great. I mean, the Attitude Era, that was huge. But when you look at the actual context of the wrestling and some of the gimmicks and some of the gimmicks of the matches that took place and the format of the show, yes, it was very appealing to the bubble of what fans were looking for at the time, right? And again, that's 9/10 of the battle. That's 9/10 of the battle when it comes to WWE is catering to the fan base you've got at the time, because it always is shifting. And up until they lost the plot, they really did have their ear to the wall as far as what the fans were wanting. And it took, that's why the New Generation Era ended when it ended, because they knew that there needed to be more attitude and more of this. I don't give a damn. Jerry Springer Crash TV, which appeals to some but does not seem to age well, I've noticed. And for what it was at the time, it was a very fun bubble, and there was a lot of really exciting things that came out of it. I mean, most people, when you look back, they'll tell you, when you say, "Oh, you liked wrestling," well, like, who'd you like? They're either going to tell you usually one of like 3 people: Hogan, Austin, Rock. And then, you start talking about other people, and they'll be like, "Oh, yeah, I remember that," or the Ultimate Warrior, I guess, gets into that Randy Savage gets into that conversation sometimes. But anyway, the overall point being is that it's not that the talent wasn't there, but you look at the talent that was on the top tier of the card, and then what was going on everywhere else. It wasn't really until 99-2000 that... Well, I guess that's not a fair assumption, but I guess that's not a fair statement, because they did have a pretty decent mid-card that filled in through and filled a lot, but a lot of it was... There was definitely some cringy formatting and some really stupid stuff that came out of this, too. That has not changed throughout the entire Vincent K identity of WWE. And that is probably not going to change until Vince is gone, or they sell the company or whatever the case may be. But the reason the Attitude Era isn't ranked higher is, yes, it did have the 2 biggest drawing stars in the business at the same time. But overall, the length of matches, the quality of matches was really weak for the most part. Except for the really big, memorable matches, that was what was sacrificed for the sake of the Crash TV entertainment stuff, because it became everybody just fight and a whole bunch of run-ins and a whole bunch, you know, that speed, let's do this, and save for the main angles. A lot of the Attitude Era was just a bunch of discombobulated junk, but because it was all happening fast, everybody ate it up, which is why, you know, we got things like Mae Young giving birth to Mark Henry's pan baby, amongst other things. So this era, it obviously had the big stars. Of course, the invasion angle, the Attitude Era loses points for how badly they flummoxed what could have been the greatest angle in wrestling history in that invasion angle, and how badly they rushed it, and they just did not come to pass the way that they wanted it to happen. Of course, again, with the major angles, it had WWE's, arguably what many consider to be their best pay-per-view of all time, WrestleMania 17 or X7, if you're that kind of wrestling fan. So there was obviously that. So there was, again, it's not for lack of major moments. It's not for lack of big stars. They had big stars. Hogan, Rock. Or, I'm sorry, not Hogan. Well, they did have Hogan in 2002, but we'll get to that. You got The Rock. You got Steve Austin. You got Triple H. You got Jericho to a lesser extent. Benoit to a lesser extent. You got Eddie Guerrero to a lesser extent. You know, they would all kind of become what they would become later. But you also at the same time, you know, and they were coming in, but they were already big deals coming from WCW. You've got a lot of talent here, but I think that a lot of it was so confusing just for the fact that Vince Russo had a hand in it. Oh yeah, and remember, I think it was Test tattooed Albert's ass. That was another one too. It was a weird time. The Kettle from Hell match. It was a weird time. The coffin thing with Big Show and the Boss Man. It was a weird time. It was a weird time, but it was undoubtedly a successful time. But you also have to acknowledge what that did as far as the repercussions of trying to revitalize pro wrestling after that. It became an increasingly tall order. And then what WWE was eventually going to become, it's no surprise that a lot of things that happened in the Attitude Era were very significant precursors to what the issues we have now. But that's not to take away from its overall success. Which brings us to number 2. And it took me a minute to figure out how I wanted to rank this. But I'm going to put Ruthless Aggression Era number 2. Because Ruthless Aggression was great. It had the best talent roster. It had a huge, you know, they had 2 brands that they divided. So you got twice the number of shows. They got a lot of loyal viewership. And yes, the numbers were going down pretty much consistently throughout. But there was still enough passion. There was still enough fire. There was still enough pro wrestling. It was the best era for pro wrestling mixed with the sports entertainment. This was really the ultimate blend of what was going to become the work rate heavy style and the work rate heavy attitude and desire that a lot of wrestling fans would end up growing up on, because they grew up in the Ruthless Aggression era where they got the quality work rate from those workhorses and the eventual world champions like Eddie and Benoit and Jericho and to, you know, Ultimo Dragon and Chavo and Mysterio and Angle and The Undertaker were doing Biker Taker and was fine, and Van Dam was there, and Jeff Hardy, you know, the Hardys split and they were doing great. The Dudley, there were so many people. The Dudleys, Trish Stratus was coming into her own. Bradshaw, I know a lot of people don't like his 2004 run. I did. I wish he didn't win it the way he won it and then keep it for that long. I wish he had been able to definitively beat Eddie to win it and then go on, but that's just me. Batista got made in this era. The amount of talent that was, and this was another big factor too. Stars were still being made in the Ruthless Aggression era, as well as Hardy having a very lucrative talent pool. You get Batista made. You get Orton made. Carlito, to some extent, definitely got more over. Van Dam got more over. The making of Jeff as a true singles competitor. Edge became the world champion he was destined to be. Christian kind of floated around a little bit and then ended up leaving, but I think that ended up being worth it for what he would end up becoming. But he was still a big factor in the mid-card, undoubtedly. The Big Show's still there. The return of Shawn Michaels in the Ruthless Aggression era. And my favorite match of all time, which is the non-sanctioned match between Triple H and Shawn Michaels at SummerSlam 2002. Is it the best technical match of all time? No, but as far as storytelling and passion and what they accomplished, still, I would go back and watch that any day, anytime. I still love it to this day. Ruthless Aggression era had the perfect mix of what became the ECW style with the Ruthless Aggression and the ladders and all that the Attitude Era picked up. The still being able to get juice, but still being able to tell really intriguing pro wrestling stories in the ring. The work rate was solid. The storytelling was solid. You had so much talent. You had, the NWO was there. Hogan was back for a brief period. The invention of Brock Lesnar coming up and him being one of the biggest stars. John Cena was made in the Ruthless Aggression era. It was so big. And yes, they lost Austin. And yes, they lost The Rock. And yes, they had Goldberg for a year, and then that was that. And, oh yeah, Scott Steiner was there too. But the amount of talent was so unbelievably huge in the Ruthless Aggression era. The storylines, minus Katie Vick, were solid for the most part. Again, each era has its good, bad, and the ugly, so I'm not really going to critique them on that. But for the most part, the stories were good, the wrestling was good, the talent roster was there, and they were still drawing a good amount of money. It really was the blend of both worlds. They had top guys, even though they weren't drawing the way that wrestling would draw, but I think that's because the competition was really gone and the cat was out of the bag as far as kayfabe goes, and anyone who didn't like WWE just wasn't going to come back. And that was the bottom line. So that's where it becomes number two, because it just for the sheer drawing power and that the fact that the ratings started to dwindle here by no fault of any of the talent. It's just that this was the way that wrestling was becoming as WWE tried to cement its place as the only game in town, or the only real game in town. This is what became of it. Booker T, forgot to mention another good one. I forgot in the rise of San Martino, I forgot to mention Freddie Blassie. While I'm thinking about it, I mean, there's tons of people I'm missing too. So I'm not even gonna. Ernie Ladd, another good one, for that one. But so here's our list up to this point: the new era, 2016 to present; the PG era, 2008 to 2013; the reality era, 2014 to 2016; the transitional period, 1979 to 1982; the new generation era, 93 to 97; the Attitude Era, 97 to 2002; the Ruthless Aggression Era, 2002 to 2008; and then finally, number one, and this is where we're going to close the show today, because we went way long on this, but I really think it was fun to do, and I'm glad we did it. The Golden Era, the Rock and Wrestling, the Hogan Era. Now, the reason I put the Hogan Era on this number one is for several reasons. Number one, this was when going national, the big risk, was met with the big payoff. They had the guy, they had Hogan, who was drawing them buckets and buckets and buckets of money. Hogan, a huge top guy. Warrior, huge top guy. New stars in here were made. They got Undertaker came in. They had Slaughter, they took everybody from everywhere, between Slaughter, Piper, the Hart Foundation. They had the best tag team division they would ever have with the Bulldogs and Axe and Smash and the Hart Foundation. They had the major names like Randy Savage and Ricky Steamboat. Flair for a year that counts as the golden era because he popped in there in 92 and this ended in 93, right around the time. You know, you got Piper. Then you had the inclusion of the celebrities. You had Mr. T. You had Cyndi Lauper. You had all the Liberace. You started getting more mainstream people into wrestling. It became this huge cultural phenomenon. And it never really gained, with the exception of the Attitude Era, it never gained that kind of mainstream appeal and excitement ever again. And a big part of that was just the way that this was when formatting and national television and knowing that national television was going to take over, it was the smartest strategic business plan to deal with, which is also why the new generation is down a little bit, because you also got to remember the new generation era was also a victim of the steroid trial, which the golden era did not have. But you've got the Rick Martels, you've got the Tito Santanas, you've got all of these guys, the Iron Sheik, somewhat. I guess the point I'm making here is you got the buckets of money, you got the big name draws, you got the top guys coming in to take on Hulk Hogan. Hogan's drawing stupid amounts of money. And what Hogan is not doing as far as wrestling goes, people like Savage and Steamboat are making up for it. They got Jake Roberts on the roster. They've got, I mentioned the Ultimate Warrior. I'll mention Papa Shango just because it's always fun to mention Papa Shango. Hi, Papa Shango. Hope you're doing well. Owen Hart was here at the time, you know, so he was still doing his thing. There was so much. It was the perfect blend of entertainment, just that slight over-the-top type of gimmick, the over-the-top format mixed with the groundedness of the pro wrestling and the quality of pro wrestlers that were there and could work and could really stack shows and make them look A grade. You had the drawing power, you had the roster, you had the network deal, you had the national television deal, you had the pay-per-view, you had WrestleMania. It was a perfect storm, and you had the mainstream. Hook, line, and sinker. Wrestling was never this exciting, even in the Attitude Era. The Golden Era, it lasted longer. It had more of an impact. It made WWE what it was. We talked all podcast about identity. The only real identity WWE will always be able to solidify is this era. Because when most people think WWE, the first thing they think of is Hulk Hogan. They think of Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage and all of these guys from the 80s who were the definition of what WWE pro wrestling, what sports entertainment under the WWF banner was going to be like. And that is why, beyond comparison, the Golden Era, in my opinion, is the top, is the best, is the number one, the best era in WWE. It's the total package. And they even had the total. Actually, no, I guess total package was New Generation. But that's okay. We'll leave Luger for another time. I had more to talk about, but for the life of me, I'm being told that we need to take a break. Which is apropos because we're nearing an hour here of the fantastic wrestling talk. Before we go, I just want to mention something real quick. I was going to do the Match of the Week review this week, but because we are running kind of low on time, if you want to watch it, it was Tracy Smothers versus the Dirty White Boy, Bluegrass Brawl 93, Smoky Mountain Wrestling. It was a good watch, interesting match. You can get my reaction there. There is the link in the description for that match if you want to watch that match alone, which is, of course, something to do. Next week, we have a new Match of the Week. Gonna stream that on Tuesday. And then we're going to have our Full Gear review coming up on Friday on the Court-Martail podcast proper. I just want to make a quick little homage to some of the, and I will do this in December as well, but because Tracy Smothers just passed away, and I wanted to mention this really quick before we go to break. Tracy Smothers, once again, another guy I didn't know a whole lot about until he passed, and then I had to go back and watch him. It's a shame that Tracy was broken in at a time when someone like him was starting to get phased out of wrestling, because he is absolutely a classic old school Southern brawler worker. I loved it. He's a great seller. He's a great athlete. Shame he had to go. Universally liked by almost everybody. So at least from what I hear, he fought a long battle with cancer, but ended up coming out on the wrong side of it. So rest in peace, Tracy Smothers. We'll add you to the list, and we're going to do an in memoriam and at the end of December, and you're going to be surprised just how many names we're going to have to shout out here. But until that time, we got plenty of time for that. Right now, we're going to take our first commercial break. Full Gear review coming up next week. We will see you at the live stream. Thank you much for watching, and we will see you after this commercial break.